Stephen, get us up to speed on how traders are adjusting to the mixed messaging out of the Middle East.
You know, I think that of all the situations, worst case scenarios that they were planning for today, when today was supposed to end the ceasefire.
On the radar plot, the formation looked almost too small for what Washington was asking it to do. 8 RH-53D helicopters, heavy, slow, and blacked out, were crossing into Iranian airspace at low altitude, skimming toward a dead patch of desert called Desert 1. Ahead of them sat 53 American hostages in Tehran. Behind them stood a president running out of time and options. The aircraft had been sent into one of the most hostile skies in the region for a mission so delicate it depended on darkness, silence, and luck. Before the night was over, that luck would run out so completely that none of those 8 helicopters would ever make it back home. This was the crisis stripped to its hardest edge. This was the moment Washington finally decided to reach into Iran by force. Months of negotiations had failed. The U.S. Embassy in Tehran had been seized. American diplomats had been paraded as symbols of humiliation. Every day the hostages stayed in captivity, the crisis deepened, and every day the United States looked weaker in the eyes of allies, rivals, and the men holding those prisoners behind embassy walls. By April 1980, President Jimmy Carter approved a rescue mission that was as bold as it was fragile. The operation was called Eagle Claw. To understand why the mission became a trap, you have to understand the battlefield. Tehran was not a coastal target. It was not an isolated compound in open country. It was a crowded capital buried deep inside Iran, shielded by distance, terrain, and politics. There were no friendly bases next door. No clean corridor. No simple airborne assault. To reach the hostages, American forces would have to cross hundreds of miles of hostile airspace at night, land in the desert, refuel in secret, hide through the day, infiltrate the city the next night, storm the embassy and a second diplomatic site, seize a separate airfield, then fly everyone out before the Iranian state could react with armor, fighters, militia, or massed gunfire in the streets. It was not one mission. It was a chain of missions, and every link had to hold. That is what made the stakes so severe. If Eagle Claw worked, the United States would recover its people and prove that distance and political chaos could not shield an enemy from American reach. If it failed, the opposite message would echo across the region. Iran would look defiant. America would look exposed. The hostages could be killed or scattered. Any surviving assault force could be trapped in the middle of Iran with no easy exit. Even success carried enormous risk. Failure promised strategic damage far beyond one night in the desert. Washington could have chosen louder options. Airstrikes against Iranian facilities would have been simpler to explain and easier to stage. But bombing would not guarantee the hostages lived through the night. A rescue, if it worked, could free the prisoners and limit the crisis before it widened into open war. That was the appeal and the danger. The operation had to be violent enough to break through armed resistance, but precise enough to avoid turning the embassy into a graveyard. That demanded a surgical use of force inside one of the most politically charged cities on Earth. In practice, that meant the margin for error was almost non-existent from the first takeoff. The men building the rescue plan knew that. They also knew they were trying to do something the U.S. military was not truly organized to do in 1980. The force package had to be assembled from separate services, separate commands, separate cultures, and aircraft not designed to operate together in this kind of raid. The ground rescue force would ride Air Force MC-130 combat Talons from Masira Island near Oman. Fuel bladders would be carried in Air Force EC-130s. Rangers would later seize an escape airfield at Mansouriya. Delta Force would hit the embassy. The helicopter lift would come from 8 Navy RH-53DC Stallions launched from the carrier USS Nimitz south of Iran. Later, AC-130 gunships were supposed to cover the extraction. It was an intricate machine built out of parts that had not grown up together. The weapons logic behind Eagle Claw was ruthless in its sequencing. The MC-130s were not just transports. They were the first key that opened the mission, carrying the assault force into Iran and bringing the combat controllers who would make a dark stretch of desert usable within minutes. The EC-130s were flying fuel depots, because without that gas on the ground, the helicopters would never have the reach to continue. The RH-53DS were the bridge between the desert and Tehran, chosen for range and lift, not elegance. Delta Force was the blade intended for the embassy itself. Rangers would seize the escape airfield. On the second night, AC-130 gunships were meant to orbit overhead as airborne armor, ready to tear apart any Iranian ground response and suppress fighters on the runway if the extraction turned into a running battle. Even the final pickup points in Tehran reflected hard realism. The hostages might be collected at the embassy, or if the chaos became too dense, at a nearby soccer stadium. Every part of the operation existed to buy the next part a few more minutes. And that machine had no room for friction. At Desert 1, a remote landing strip prepared in secret by combat controllers, the mission required a minimum of 6 operational helicopters to continue. Not 5. 6. That number was not a preference. It was the line between possible and impossible. Fewer than 6 meant there would not be enough lift to move the assault force and the rescued hostages the way the plan demanded. That meant the entire operation rested on a narrow arithmetic of engines, hydraulics, navigation systems, weather, timing, and human endurance. 1 serious breakdown could be absorbed. 2 would put the raid on the edge. 3 would kill it. There was another trap buried inside the timetable. Eagle Claw depended on moonlight, darkness, and the narrow seam before dawn. The helicopters had to reach Desert 1, refuel, move the assault force to a hide site, and clear the area before daylight exposed the whole package. Once the formation fell behind, the pressure increased on everyone. Maintenance decisions became harder. Refueling became more urgent. Commanders were no longer managing a plan, they were trying to keep a collapsing schedule from dragging the mission into sunrise. The first part of the night belonged to the fixed-wing crews. MC-130s carrying the assault force and combat controllers came in low and dark toward Desert 1. The landing zone sat on a salt flat and open desert roughly 200 miles southeast of Tehran, chosen because it was isolated enough to hide a rendezvous yet firm enough to take loaded C-130s. When the lead aircraft touched down, the Americans moved fast. Combat controllers began marking the strip. Security elements pushed out. Then the battlefield reminded everyone that even a lonely desert in Iran was never truly empty. A passenger bus rolled down the road that cut through the landing site. It was stopped, and its passengers were detained. Then a fuel truck came through the same corridor and failed to stop. American troops fired a light anti-tank weapon into it, turning the truck into a column of fire and spilling light across a mission built on darkness. A pickup appeared, then turned away and escaped. In a matter of minutes, the rescue force had gone from hidden to exposed, potentially. They kept going because they had no real alternative. The helicopters were still inbound. The clock was still moving. The mission had to hold together long enough for the next piece to arrive. Out over the Arabian Sea and then across the Iranian coast, the helicopter crews were already fighting a very different battle. The RH-53DS were large minesweeping helicopters adapted for a task that demanded long-range, low-altitude navigation over land at night. They had the legs for the job, but that did not make them ideal. Flying low kept them harder to detect, but it also pinned them inside the desert atmosphere, where visibility could collapse without warning and instruments had to carry far more of the burden. The crews pushed inland at night, trying to keep formation discipline, fuel margins, and timing intact. Then the first helicopter took a hit from mechanics, not enemy fire. A cockpit warning indicated a possible rotor blade failure. The crew made the only call they believed they could make. They landed and abandoned the aircraft. Now there were 7. That alone did not doom the raid. The plan had started with 8 because one loss might be survivable. But soon after, the formation encountered what would become the real enemy of the night, towering walls of suspended desert dust, the kind of wind-driven sandstorm the region knows well and pilots fear for good reason. A haboob is not just bad weather. It is blindness with mass. It swallows horizon, moonlight, spacing, and judgment. For the combat talons at higher altitude, the dust was a warning. For helicopters hugging low level in the dark, it became a grinding, disorienting trap. Inside that dust, the second failure arrived. One helicopter began losing critical flight and navigation instruments. In daylight, over friendly territory, with room to climb and sort it out, the crew might have had options. Here they were flying deep inside Iran, low, heavy, and nearly blind. The pilot turned back toward the carrier. It was a rational decision made inside impossible conditions. It was also devastating. Now there were 6. 6 was still enough, but only just. That meant every remaining aircraft had to reach Desert 1 and had to be fit to continue. The sandstorm scattered the formation, delayed arrival, and forced the helicopters to come in not as one clean package but in broken intervals from different directions. On the ground, the waiting crews could do little except watch the darkness and count each new arrival like a heartbeat. 1, 2, 3, then more. The mission was late now, badly late, but when the 6th helicopter finally reached Desert 1, hope snapped back into the operation. It was behind schedule. Still alive. Then the final number changed. One of the helicopters that had pressed on through the dust had done so with a hydraulic problem. At Desert 1, the crew and helicopter commander checked it and found what no one wanted to hear. The aircraft could not be repaired in time, and it was not safe to continue unrepaired. A failed hydraulic pump and leaking fluid had pushed that machine past the line. That helicopter had made it into Iran. It had reached the rendezvous. But it was done. Now there were 5. And 5 meant Eagle Claw was over. This was the tightest part of the response window, the moment when strategy collapses into arithmetic. On the ground, under pressure, commanders weighed the only question that mattered. Could the force go forward with fewer aircraft than planned? The answer, once stripped of hope, was no. Delta Force could not simply become smaller without changing the assault itself. The hostages still had to be moved. The city was still hostile. The escape still depended on mass, speed, and enough lift to survive contact. Pressing on with too little aviation would not be daring. It would be gambling with no recovery path. The abort decision moved up the chain. The message reached Washington. President Carter concurred. The mission that had taken months to plan died in a few sentences spoken over radios and secure lines. No assault on the embassy. No run into Tehran. No AC-130 shield over the city. The men at Desert One now had one job left: get out. Even that was hard. The site was crowded with aircraft, men, fuel bladders, vehicles, prisoners from the bus, and mounting fatigue. The helicopters had to reposition and refuel for the return to Nimitz while the assault force loaded back onto the C-130s. Rotor wash kicked up dense dust from the desert floor. Night vision was poor. Separation margins were thin. No one had rehearsed this exact withdrawal under these exact conditions after this exact kind of abort. And that is where the trap closed. One RH-53D needed to move so another aircraft could top off for the flight back. Instead of taxiing cleanly, the helicopter lifted into its own storm of dust. In that brownout, with visibility shredded by rotor wash and desert grit, the pilot lost the visual picture. The massive rotor system sliced into a parked EC-130 loaded with fuel and men. The collision was instant and catastrophic. Metal hit fuel. Fuel hit fire. The night erupted. The EC-130 and helicopter were engulfed almost immediately. Flames rolled through the aircraft. Ammunition began cooking off. Burning fragments shot across the landing zone. Men inside the transport had to scramble out through smoke and panic while others dragged the wounded clear. 5 Air Force airmen and 3 Marines were killed. Several more were injured. Nearby helicopters were struck by shrapnel. Fuel, time, and order were vanishing together. Any illusion that this was still a controlled extraction disappeared in that fireball. The rescue force had entered Iran to save Americans. Now Americans were dying in the desert before even reaching Tehran. Commanders did the only thing left that made military sense. They abandoned the surviving helicopters, loaded every living man they could onto the remaining C-130s, and launched out of Desert One fast. That is why the title matters. 8 American aircraft crossed into enemy airspace that night, and none of them ever came home. One had been abandoned in the desert after a warning light suggested rotor danger. One turned back to Nimitz, but the full force of 8 that entered the operation never returned intact from Iran. One was lost to hydraulics at the rendezvous. One was destroyed in collision with a fuel ship. The remaining helicopters, damaged, stranded, or unusable in the chaos, were left behind on Iranian soil when the transports fled the burning site. By sunrise, the wreckage of Eagle Claw belonged to the world's cameras. The aftermath was brutal because it was visible. Iran displayed the shattered aircraft and the bodies of the dead. Washington had to admit the rescue had failed. For the hostage families, the operation brought no relief. For the military, the pain cut deeper than the loss alone. The plan itself had not been crazy. In concept, it had a chance. But the mission had demanded perfect coordination from an improvised joint force, flawless performance from aircraft operating at the edge of their design and maintenance realities, and clean weather across a route where weather had not been fully understood by the crews who most needed that knowledge. Eagle Claw did not fail because American forces lacked courage. It failed because courage could not close the gaps between planning, equipment, conditions, and command structure. That lesson hit hard inside the Pentagon. The disaster exposed weak joint integration, blurry command relationships, poor interoperability, and the danger of building a national rescue mission from separate pieces that barely trained together as one organism. Out of that humiliation came reform. Joint Special Operations Command took shape soon after. Later came U.S. Special Operations Command and a much deeper commitment to specialized aviation, unified planning, and realistic joint rehearsal. In other words, Desert One burned away illusions. It showed what modern rescue warfare actually demands. But none of that could change what happened that night. The hostages remained in captivity. 8 Americans were dead. A rescue mission launched to restore national credibility ended by advertising American vulnerability to the entire world. The desert did not defeat the raid alone. Neither did Iran's air defenses. The mission was defeated by the kind of pressure that exposes every hidden weakness at once: distance, dust, timing, maintenance, secrecy, fragmented command, and the merciless fact that in military operations, sometimes a mission can be tactically sound and still collapse because reality will not grant one more margin. Desert One is remembered as a failure, and it was. But it was also a warning written in fire. If a nation wants the power to reach into hostile territory and bring its people home, it cannot improvise that power at the last minute. It has to build it, train it, integrate it, and test it until the impossible becomes routine. Eagle Claw tried to do that in reverse. It asked a fragile machine for perfection inside enemy airspace, and the machine broke before the shooting even began. 8 aircraft crossed into Iran under cover of darkness. By dawn, only the fire made it all the way to daylight.